Hi. Welcome to Creative Movies Recapped. Today's recap is a 2004 African historical drama war film titled Hotel Rwanda. Watch out for spoilers ahead. Before we continue, please subscribe to support our channel. This film is based on a true story. Rwanda is a small landlocked country in the east of Africa that was colonized by Germany and later Belgium. Rwanda has two major ethnic groups, the Hutu, who are the majority, and the Tutsis, who are the minority. It is the year 1994. George Rusesabagina, who is a local leader of a brutal government-backed Hutu militia called the Interahamwe, is giving a hate speech against the Tutsi tribe on the radio. He says that the Tutsi were collaborators of the Belgium colonies who came to steal the Hutu land. He calls the Tutsi people cockroaches and a minority of traitors and invaders who are not supposed to be in Rwanda. He says the Hutu people will wipe out all the Tutsi rebels and should watch out for their neighbors. It is a normal market day in Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda. Paul Rusesabagina, a Hutu, and the manager of a Belgium-owned hotel Mills Collins, is picking up special hotel food at the airport sent from Belgium. Hotel Mills Collins is a luxury hotel, owned by Sabina, the national airline of Belgium. It is a 4-star hotel where only white people and powerful Africans come to spend time. He interacts well with the white people of Belgium who live in Rwanda and tips police officers on the road. His driver Dube, who is Tutsi, is loyal to Paul and also works as a staff in the Belgium hotel. He later collects more supplies from George Rusesabagina, who is also a famous goods supplier, and gives him a Cohiba cigar from Cuba as a gift and a bunch of money. While loading the food supplies in Paul's van, George's employers mishandle stuff in the warehouse, and one box containing machetes drops and breaks open. Paul and Dube are terrified, but George tells Paul not to be worried, but he should instead join him in the rally against the Tutsi. Paul declines and says he has no time for political rallies and politics. As Paul is returning to the hotel, he and Dube are discussing the broadcast on the Hutu radio encouraging the death of the Tutsis. The two drive through a Hutu rally and are forced to stop because of the crowd. Several Hutus in the group recognize Dube as a Tutsi and begin yelling for his death. Paul calms them down by holding up his traditional Hutu shirt and shows them they are both supporters of their cause. They drive away. Paul and Dube arrive at the hotel. The hotel is bustling with white Western visitors and Rwandan employees. The United Nations officer Colonel Oliver and General Bizimungu of the Rwandan army are sitting poolside discussing the impending peace accord between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and the threat of the Interahamwe Hutu rebels. Paul approaches and welcomes them. Following what is custom, Paul retrieves 2 bottles of scotch from a well-stocked storeroom and asks an employee to place them in the Rwandan general's briefcase. Paul leaves the hotel and is listening to radio announcements that call for the death of the Tutsis. He switches the frequency to a discussion on the United Nations-sponsored peace accord. While driving, many people on the street recognize him and give their greetings. Paul is welcomed at home by his wife, Tatiana, who greets him with a kiss. At home, the Rusesabagina children are coloring inside, while the parents are talking in the next room. Roger, Paul's son, frantically enters the room to announce that there are soldiers outside. Paul goes outside to find soldiers from the Rwandan army across the street abusing his neighbor. Screaming is heard, and the soldiers drag their neighbors out of the house and beat them on account of their assumed Tutsi identity. Hutu fighters are beating Paul's neighbor, Victor. Paul is seen hiding his wife from the soldiers' sight. Closing the gate, he whispers that there is nothing we can do. In bed that same evening, Tatiana asks why the neighbor was killed. She begs Paul to use his contacts to help the neighbors. Yet, he tells her he cannot, as he is saving his contacts to protect his own family. It is morning. Paul arrives at the hotel as journalists from all over the Western world are checking in for the upcoming signing of the United Nations brokered peace accord. He greets 3 journalists and offers his services. At the hotel bar, one of the Western journalists inquires about the actual differences between Hutus and Tutsis. It is explained to him by a Kigali journalist that there is no true difference beyond appearance. Hutus are described as taller and more elegant, and the Tutsis have bigger noses. The Western journalist tries to make sense of this difference and inquires about the identities of those around him. Immediately before the news conference, there is talk of the possibility that the Rwandan army is supplying the Hutu rebels. The Hutus are said to have denied this claim. The news conference begins, and peace is toasted by the United Nations envoy in a room filled with journalists. Outside, the Rwandan general sarcastically speaks of the ideas of peace. On the evening after the press conference, Paul is having drinks with his brother-in-law, Thomas. He tells Paul that a friend told him to flee from the country because there is a sign of war. Thomas's wife tells Paul to let Tatiana go with them out of the country since they are all Tutsi, but Paul tells them that all shall be okay since the UN are in the country. As Paul drives home from the hotel, he sees many homes being burnt to the ground and the Rwandan army all over the streets. He finds his home in complete darkness. The home seems empty, and using his flashlight he walks through looking for his wife. He finds her and 30 of his Tutsi neighbors crammed into a small room. Pulling his wife aside, Paul is told by his wife that the Rwandan president has been killed and the Tutsis are terrified of possible slaughter at the hands of the Hutus. She cannot get in touch with her brother. Paul reassures her that everything will be okay. The neighbors seek refuge in Paul's house since he is the only Hutu they can trust, and he directs them to other rooms in his house. His son goes missing and they find him lying in the bushes all covered with blood. After putting him on the table and properly checking him, they discover that the blood is not his and that someone poured another person's blood on his body as a sign of war since the kid is a half Tutsi. The neighbors spend the night, and in the morning chaos has already begun in Rwanda, and gunshots are heard all over. The radio broadcaster confirms the death of the Rwandan president and begins yelling to the Hutus to cut down the tall trees. The Rwandan army arrives at Paul's home and demands his identification. It is labeled Hutu, and, given this, neither Paul nor his Tutsi friends are killed. The army wants access to the Diplomat Hotel, Paul's place of former employment. He agrees to let them in only if he can bring with him his family and neighbors. On the drive to the Diplomat Hotel, dead bodies are seen all over the streets. Shots are being fired, and Hutus are running all over the place. Upon arriving at the hotel, Paul opens the safe and puts money in his pocket. Gunshots followed by screams are heard. Paul runs outside. The Rwandan general discovers that those who were with Paul were, in fact, Tutsis. He demands that Paul shoot them. He offers the general money to release everyone. The general agrees to 100,000 francs. To get the money, the group must go to the Hotel Colleen. Paul and the general exchange francs for prisoners upon arriving at the Hotel Colleen. The Tutsis thank Paul. The manager of the Hotel Colleen leaves Rwanda to escape the imminent mass murders and places Paul in charge of the hotel. Paul puts those he brought to the hotel into a suite. Without luck, Paul and his wife desperately attempt to reach her brother on the phone. Radio announcement is heard informing Westerners who are in Rwanda that their governments are doing everything in their power to evacuate them. Upon hearing his employee Grégoire is sleeping in the hotel's presidential suite, Paul approaches him. Grégoire, who is a Hutu, threatens Paul with the fact that Paul is hiding cockroaches, or Tutsis. A Red Cross worker shows up at the hotel with a van filled with 10 Tutsi children. The children are young and many are stained with blood. She tells Paul that they are all orphans whose parents were killed in front of them. Paul agrees to take them, and she tells him that she is going to have to bring more over. Paul and his wife Tatiana are sitting on a bed talking about the praise that those Paul saved are offering him. He tells Tatiana that everything will soon be over. Paul suddenly remembers that he took in 10 orphans and runs to find them. He walks into a dark room, and 10 children are sitting on the floor, silently. He calls his employee and asks her to take care of them, bathe them, feed them, and put them to bed. Paul is speaking to the United Nations peace envoy and asking for help. The UN representative refuses. He tells Paul that the United Nations are peacekeepers, not peacemakers. He cannot intervene. Several Western journalists are arguing whether or not they should go outside the gates of the hotel and get footage. The news anchor refuses, but the cameraman goes out against his boss's orders. The kitchen staff is listening to the radio as Paul enters the kitchen. The broadcaster is calling for more murders and Paul begins to scold his employees to turn off the radio and get back to work. The employees decline to work, but Paul calls the directors of Sabina Hotel in Belgium, who own the Hotel Mills Collines, and gets a letter to convince them that he is in control of the hotel, which makes them listen to him. When the director asks whether or not they should shut the hotel down, Paul refuses, calling the hotel an oasis of calm. Paul goes into the hotel room of a Western journalist to repair an air conditioner. The news is on the television, telling the world that the murders are simply ploys by the Rwandan army and the Hutus to intimidate the West and thereby cause a troop pullout. The journalist who left the hotel earlier to get footage returns to the hotel room is able to secure video of live murders. He plays the video, and on the television, the slaughter of Tutsis is seen. The Hutus are using machetes and are cutting off Tutsis' heads. The journalist calls his stations and asks if the footage will be able to make the evening news. Later that same evening, the journalists are eating dinner and Paul approaches. The journalist apologizes for showing him that footage, but Paul thanks him. He tells him that the world will now see what is happening and will be forced to intervene. The journalist tells Paul that those in the West will watch it on television, say it is terrible, and then continue eating dinner. There is trouble at the hotel gates. Everyone is running and screaming. The Hutus have surrounded the entire hotel. The Hutus are on the back of trucks dressed as clowns and are all carrying machetes. They throw a blood-stained United Nations helmet at the United Nations peacekeepers who are ordered to not shoot. The United Nations cannot intervene, even if 10 of their men has been murdered. The Hutus drive off and leave the gates of the hotel. Colonel Oliver tells Paul that the Europeans are putting together an intervention force and nothing could be done to protect the hotel until that happens. The woman from the Red Cross comes to the hotel and tells Paul that she made it to his brother-in-law's home. While she could not find him or his wife, she was able to locate their 2 young daughters. The 2 children were with an older lady across the street from where their parents were killed. The European Intervention Force arrives at the hotel to the cheers of both Westerners and Rwandans. Paul sees Colonel Oliver yelling at the general in charge of the intervention force. Colonel Oliver walks inside and is followed by Paul. Paul and Colonel Oliver are speaking at the hotel bar. Paul congratulates the colonel, who tells him that there is no need for congratulations as the force is not going to stop the slaughters. They were only there to pick up the Westerners. Later that evening in a hotel room, Paul is speaking to Tatiana. He tells her that the whites are going to be evacuated and the intervention force is leaving everyone else behind. They have been abandoned. Paul is angry at himself for being so hospitable to the whites for so many years. He feels stupid and deceived. The United Nations is leaving a mere 300 peacekeepers in the entire country. The evacuation of the West begins. All of the Westerners are boarding the bus to leave Rwanda while everyone is crying. The Westerners want to bring the Rwandans with them and they cannot because the bus is only for those from the West. Paul tells the Rwandans to calm down because there is nothing that can be done. As the bus drives away, the Rwandans stand at the steps of the hotel staring as the whites go. Later that evening, Paul and Tatiana are talking on a bed. She tells him to leave with the kids and let them kill her since Paul is Hutu, but Paul refuses. Paul and Tatiana are awoken by the pressure of a gun on their head. A Rwandan army leader orders Paul and everyone at the hotel to leave in 10 minutes. Paul buys time by telling the gentleman to wait for him as he brings beer to them before they leave the hotel. Under the bed is Roger, who became terrified at the sight of the members of the army. Paul tells his wife to go to the roof with the children. He is trying to reach the Rwandan army general as the Rwandan army in the hotel demands a guest list. Unable to reach the general, Paul makes contact with the director of Sabina Hotel in Belgium. Paul thanks the director for everything he has done for him and tells him that he is going to be killed. This prompts the director to contact the French government, who supply the Hutu rebels, to plead for the end of the raid on the hotel. In the hotel lobby, the army is spilling beer on the Rwandan refugees. Paul prints out an old guest list. The army leader looks at the list and demands an accurate list or he is going to kill everyone who is staying in the hotel. As Paul walks away, the army leader gets a call over his talkie ordering him and his men to leave the hotel. Paul receives another call from the director of Sabina who tells him that he pleaded with the French and the British to help those in the hotel and they refused. The director apologizes and wishes Paul the best. Paul meets with the refugees in the hotel lobby. There are hundreds of people in the room. He tells them that no more intervention force or rescue will come and that they can only save themselves. He tells all refugees to call those they know abroad and tell them goodbye and shame them into helping the Rwandans. He tells those in the room to act like visitors, not refugees. The following day, the Rwandan army general is at the hotel. Paul asks the general for some police officers and blackmails him that he will testify on his behalf and say that he helped protect the Belgium property and refugees and so he'll be rewarded. Paul lies that the Americans are watching his every move through satellites. He then forces Grégoire to work with the help of the general. Low on supplies, Paul and Grégoire drive to collect hotel supplies from Georges Rutaganda and witness the Interahamwe militia raping Tutsi hostages. Georges explains to Paul that the rich cockroaches' money will become worthless since all of the Tutsis will be killed. Paul expresses disbelief that the Hutu Interahamwe militia will wipe out all of the Tutsis, but Georges replies, "Why not? We are halfway there already." They return to the hotel through the dark, thick fog of the Riverside Road recommended by Georges, only to find it is carpeted with dead bodies. Upon arriving at the hotel, Paul goes into a room, locks the door, and begins breaking down in tears while tearing off his shirt in bitterness. The refugees are having a gathering at the pool. Rwandan children are dancing with music playing in the background. While dinner is being served to the refugees, Tatiana and Paul walk onto the roof, where a candlelight dinner awaits them. There are gunshots in the background. Paul tells Tatiana that if the Hutus were to come and kill him, she should come to the roof and jump off with her kids in hand because murder by a machete is not a good way to die, and their children should not witness the murder of their parents. As children are playing in front of the hotel, Colonel Oliver arrives and gathers the group of refugees together. The calls to their relatives abroad have worked and several families have been issued exit visas. The colonel reads several names. Many are being left behind, but others, including Paul's family, are leaving at 7 a.m. the next morning. A Red Cross worker brings medical supplies and asks Paul if he is on the list. He answers in the affirmative and asks that she try to find his nieces. She tells him that they are probably dead. He assures her that he will find help for Rwandans when he leaves. Western radio announces the death toll at 500,000. Those who were issued exit visas are filling a United Nations truck. Paul says goodbye to those who are being left behind. He cannot get on the United Nations truck and leave them behind. Paul decides not to leave and closes the back door of the truck. His family begins to scream and yell for him. He tells his wife that he cannot leave those people to die. UN trucks are driving through the city as the radio is announcing death to the Tutsis. Grégoire tells the Rwandan army that Tutsis are being smuggled out by the United Nations. This is announced on the radio. They drive into an ambush and the Hutu block the road. Hutus attack the convoy with machetes in hand and demand to search the trucks. The doors are opened and Colonel Oliver tells the Hutus that those in the truck are United Nations political refugees. Paul is able to reach the Rwandan army general who sends troops to push the Hutus away. A Hutu has a machete to Tatiana's neck. He asks her name, but she does not respond. The army arrives and pushes the Hutus away. The United Nations convoy is able to flee and arrives back at the hotel. Tatiana is upset with Paul and refuses to speak to him after he stayed behind at the hotel and separated from the family. She is in shock but recovers quickly. Paul and Tatiana walk around the hotel to speak of what has just happened. The refugees are pulling water out of the pool and boiling it since the water supply to the hotel has been cut. The Rwandan general returns to the hotel and takes the protection that he put at the gates away. He demands more money from Paul. Later that evening, the refugees are eating outside, and a missile hits the hotel blowing off the top. Paul walks around the hotel and sees no injuries. In the morning, it is announced that there is a refugee exodus occurring in Rwanda. Colonel Oliver returns to the hotel and informs Paul that there has been an agreement. In exchange for Hutu prisoners, the Hutus will allow those at the hotel to cross enemy lines and enter a safe region. The transfer may be as much as 2 days away. While in bed with his wife, Paul remembers that there is money at the diplomat which he can use to bribe the Rwandan army general for protection. The general arrives and takes Paul to the diplomat to see what kind of bribe Paul is offering. Riding in the back of the army truck, Paul witnesses what has come of Kigali. Fires, screams, and people being killed ruthlessly. At the diplomat, Paul opens the safe and offers the general drinks, gold, and money. The general accepts and informs Paul that the Rwandan army has been ordered out of the city. He wants Paul to come join him. Paul refuses, calling the general a marked man. Paul demands to return to the hotel. A small argument erupts between the two. The general is about to pull out his gun, and Paul begs him to shoot but doesn't. At the Hotel Colleen, complete chaos has erupted. The Hutus entered the hotel grounds. The Rwandan general begins to shoot his gun and orders the Hutus out. Paul goes to look for his wife. Upon entering the hotel, Paul is quickly pointed out by Grégoire, and he is ambushed. The Rwandan army enters the hotel and scares the Hutus away. Paul goes to the roof and sees people lying on the ground. He instantly thinks that it is his wife and children but is mistaken. Those on the ground were faking their deaths. Paul finds his wife hiding in the shower with several others. She is holding a shower hose in defense. It is morning and the United Nations peacekeepers are loading all the refugees into trucks. They drive off, leaving the hotel behind. While driving through the streets of Kigali, thousands of people are seen flocking to the borders, running for their lives. Screams are heard, and Paul looks out of the truck to see Hutus trying to attack the convoy. The trucks are close to the line of separation between the fighting factions, and the Rwandan army is able to scare away the attackers. The trucks cross the safety line. The United Nations trucks drive into the massive refugee camp where thousands of people are in lines, eating, and looking for children. The trucks are unloaded, and Paul is told that there are buses that will take him and his family to Tanzania. Paul and his family begin to look for his nieces, and with the help of the lady working in the Red Cross, they find their two nieces in the middle of many young orphans. They later come to find out that Thomas and his wife were killed. Paul, his wife, their 4 kids, and Thomas's 2 daughters together travel to live in Belgium. At the end of the war, almost 1 million corpses are left, with Paul having saved 1,268 refugees from the hotel. General Augustin is captured and transported and tried in the UN War Tribunal, while George Rutaganda is sentenced to life in prison. Paul adopts Thomas's 2 children and raises them as his own. Hope you've enjoyed today's recap. If you did, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.